Bernard Garrett had ridden 3 days through dust and silence, carrying a dead man's promise in his coat pocket, and a name he had never spoken aloud to anyone, Elias Rourke, a rancher he had never met, a man who had saved his father's life 20 years before on a cattle trail outside of Abilene, and whose widow, Bernard had been told by every soul who knew the story, was a frail and elderly woman living alone in a valley in southern Colorado, struggling to hold together the last scraps of a life that the land and bad luck had slowly taken apart. It was the autumn of 1882, and the Colorado Territory had begun to feel the squeeze of change. The railroads were pushing through, the big cattle companies were pressing down on small ranchers, and the old ways of settling things with a handshake and a man's word were giving way to ledger books and lawyers who wore their suits like armor. Bernard had heard all of that, and he had told himself it did not concern him, that he was only riding out to Rourke Valley, a narrow green cut between two limestone ridges west of Pueblo, to offer the widow whatever help she needed for as long as she needed it, because his father, before he died, had made him swear on a Bible that he would do exactly that. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and lean from years of working cattle drives and fence lines from Texas to Montana, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that had seen enough hard country to make them careful and steady. He did not think of himself as a man who needed or wanted anything beyond the next job done well, but he was not a cold man. He carried things. He carried the weight of debts that were not his own, and he carried something quieter and harder to name, which was the particular loneliness of a man who had been moving too long to put down any kind of root. He came over the ridge in the early morning, when the light was still golden, and the valley below him was filling up with mist that rose off the creek like smoke from a slow fire. The valley was beautiful. He had not expected that. He had pictured something worn out and gray, the way a widow's life sounded in the telling, but the valley was lush and long, and the ranch house at its center was sturdy, with a good roof and a proper barn beside it, and a kitchen garden that someone had taken care to plant in neat rows. There were horses in the near pasture, 4 of them, good-looking animals, and a spotted dog sleeping on the porch steps. Bernard rode down the long slope toward the house, following a cart track that wound through the tall yellow grass, and he straightened himself in the saddle the way a man does when he is trying to arrive with some dignity. He had practiced what he was going to say. Something along the lines of, "I am Bernard Garrett, Thomas Garrett's son, and I have come to see what I can do for you." He tied his horse to the post at the yard fence and walked to the front door and knocked twice. The dog lifted its head and looked at him with some interest but did not bark. He waited. He heard footsteps inside, quick, certain footsteps, not the slow shuffle he had been bracing himself for. And then the door opened, and Bernard Garrett's carefully prepared speech dissolved entirely, because the woman who opened the door was not old. She was somewhere near 28 or 29, he guessed, though there was something in her eyes that carried more years than her face let on. She had thick auburn hair pinned back loosely, with strands falling at her temples where the morning work had pulled them free. Her eyes were a startling shade of green, the kind of green that reminded him of creek water in spring, clear and deep at the same time. She was not a small woman. She stood at the door with the straight-backed ease of someone who had been hauling water and lifting saddles and mending fences without help for a long while, and she was looking at him with an expression that was perfectly balanced between wariness and patience, like a woman who had learned to give strangers exactly as much welcome as they had earned. "You are not the widow," Bernard said, and immediately heard how that sounded and felt the heat come up under his collar. Something in her expression shifted, just barely, from patient wariness to something that might have been amusement if she had let it go that far. "I am Martha Rourke," she said. "Elias Rourke was my husband. He has been gone 2 years, so I suppose that does make me the widow unless you have some objection to the word that I am not yet understanding." Bernard took his hat off. He pressed it to his chest. "I beg your pardon, Mrs. Rourke. I only meant I had been told, that is, I was expecting someone of greater years. I meant no offense in the world." She studied him for a moment. "You have not told me who you are." "Bernard Garrett," he said. "Thomas Garrett was my father. He died in the spring. He left word that I should come out here and speak to the widow of Elias Rourke and offer whatever help I could. He said Elias saved his life on the Kishom Trail in 1861 and that the debt had never been properly settled." Something moved through Martha Rourke's face then, not grief exactly, since that had been 2 years in the working through, but something tender and old, like a memory pressing briefly against the surface of the present. "Elias mentioned your father," she said quietly. "He said Thomas Garrett was the kind of man who would rather die than let a friend come to trouble." "That was him," Bernard said. "Pretty accurate accounting." She looked at him for a long, measuring moment, and then she stepped back from the doorway and said, "You had better come in and have some coffee, Mr. Garrett. You look like you have been on that horse for 3 days. 4, actually," he said, and she looked at him with that almost amused expression again, and he walked through the door. The inside of the house was orderly in the way a capable person's house is orderly, not precious or decorative, but functional and clean, with tools and equipment stored in logical places, and a fireplace that had been recently swept, and a kitchen table that was spread with papers and account books that she had clearly been working at before he knocked. He noticed the account books because they were the kind of detail that told you something true about a person. She was managing this place herself, and she was managing it seriously. She poured coffee into 2 heavy tin mugs and set one in front of the chair she had gestured him toward, and she sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her own mug and waited. "I want to be plain about my intentions," Bernard said. "I am not here to take anything from you or propose any kind of arrangement you have not invited. I made my father a promise that I would come see what help you needed, and that is the sum of what I am here for. If you do not need anything, I will ride on and consider the debt paid." Martha looked at the account books and then back at him. "I have 600 acres, 4 horses, 40 cattle, a well that needs new casing, a south fence line that came down in the wind 3 weeks ago and has not been replaced, a barn roof that is sound but the east wall is not, and 2 ranch hands who are good men but who are stretched thin trying to cover all of it." She said all of that without any self-pity, just a steady accounting of facts. "I also have an offer on the table from a man named Harlan Cole who wants to buy this valley and will not take no for an answer, which is starting to become something more than a business inconvenience." Bernard wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. "Harlan Cole," he said. "Big cattle operation out of Denver." "The same," she said. "He has been sending his solicitor out here every 2 weeks for the better part of 6 months. The price he is offering gets higher each time, which I understand is supposed to make me feel flattered. But what it actually makes me feel is that he wants this land very badly, and that men who want things very badly sometimes stop asking and start taking." Bernard looked at her steadily. "Has he done anything, or his men done anything that you would call threatening?" She hesitated for just one breath. "Not yet," she said, "but you think it is coming. I think a woman alone on a good piece of land is an invitation to certain kinds of men," she said, and she said it without bitterness, just the flat honesty of someone who has thought the situation through from every angle and arrived at a clear assessment. "I think Elias being gone has made this place look easier to take than it is, and I think that assumption is going to be tested sooner rather than later." Bernard set his coffee mug down on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the valley morning, at the horses moving slowly in the pasture and the creek catching the sunlight between the willows, and he thought about his father, who had been a man who kept his promises even when they cost him something, and he thought about the road back east and north, which had nothing particular waiting for him. "Well," he said, "I know how to fix a fence line and repair a barn wall. And I am not entirely useless in other situations either." Martha Rourke looked at him across the table, and there was something in that look, not warmth yet, but the first careful study of something that might grow into it, and she said, "I have a spare room in the bunkhouse. The other men are Cobb Hennessy and Pete Aurelio. They are good company. Breakfast is at 6. "I will be there at 6, he said, and that was how it started. Bernard moved his horse to the barn and unpacked his bedroll and his few possessions into the bunkhouse room, which was clean and smelled of sawdust and hay. Cobb Hennessy was a wiry, red-haired Irishman of about 40 who had worked for Elias Rourke for 8 years, and who looked Bernard over with the frank appraisal of a man who has spent his life judging horses and people by the same practical standards. Pete Aurelio was younger, maybe 23, with quick dark eyes, and the kind of easy competence that comes from growing up working land. Neither of them was unfriendly, but neither of them was immediately open, either. They were men who had watched out for Martha Rourke in the way loyal employees sometimes become something closer to family without anyone saying so, and they were not about to make it easy on a stranger just because he said he meant well. That first afternoon, Bernard picked up a post-hole digger and a coil of wire and walked the south fence line with Cobb, and he worked without talking much, because he understood that the work was the introduction. A man who showed up and said he was capable was one thing. A man who showed up, said nothing, and then proved it with his hands and his back was another thing entirely. By the time they had replaced 40 yards of fence line in the last light of the evening, Cobb was talking to him like he had known him a year. "She is a remarkable woman," Cobb said, at one point, driving a post with the easy rhythm of long practice. "And I say that not to be sentimental, but because it is plainly true. She taught herself to keep the accounts after Elias went, learned to pull a calf, put her own boots on this fence line before the ground froze last winter with her own 2 hands. Some folks in Pueblo think she ought to have sold up and gone back east, and she does not have much patience for those folks." "I can see she doesn't," Bernard said. "The thing about Harlan Cole," Cobb said after a pause, and the way he said the man's name put a particular weight behind it, "is that he is not just a businessman who wants more land. He has been buying up every small ranch in the county east of here. There is a pattern to it. He gets the land, he consolidates the water rights, and then the smaller outfits that are left can't water their cattle and they sell too. This valley has the best water source in 20 miles. The creek runs year-round. That is what he really wants." Bernard coiled a length of wire. "Has she thought about talking to the county sheriff?" Cobb's expression said everything his words did not have to. "Sheriff Tabor is a man who drinks Cole's whiskey at Cole's expense," he said simply, and leaves it at that. Bernard absorbed that and stored it away. Over the next 2 weeks, he threw himself into the work of the ranch in a way that surprised even himself. There was the barn wall, which was worse than Martha had indicated. The foundation had shifted slightly in the winter frost, and the wall had begun to lean, and it needed to come down properly and be rebuilt from the base up, which was a week's work by itself. There was a section of the creek bank that had eroded badly and needed reinforcing before the spring floods came, still 6 months off, but the kind of thing you prepared for early or regretted later. There were the cattle to move to the north pasture before the south grass ran thin, and there were 2 horses with hooves that needed attention from someone who knew what they were doing. He threw himself into all of it, and not entirely because of the promise he had made his father. He began to notice things about Martha Rourke the way a person notices things when they are trying not to notice them, in the peripheral vision of their day, in the corner of their attention. He noticed that she rose every morning before 6 and was already outside before Cobb and Pete were up, walking the yard perimeter in the gray light before dawn, just looking, the way a person looks at something they love and are also afraid to lose. He noticed that she read in the evenings by the fire, holding the book with both hands the way a person holds something precious that they are not entirely sure belongs to them. He noticed that she had an extremely direct laugh, a short, genuine sound that she did not seem entirely comfortable with, as though she had learned somewhere along the way that women were supposed to express amusement in a more contained fashion, and had never quite agreed with that rule. He kept his distance, because he was aware of the line between a man in someone's employ and something else, and he was aware of how recently her husband had died, and he was aware that he was living in her barn and fixing her fences, and that any number of people would have something ungracious to say about any development that went beyond that. But the distance was hard to maintain when the ranch was small and the days were long. The first real conversation they had, real in the sense of going past logistics and the business of the ranch, happened on a Thursday evening in October, when it had rained all day, and the outdoor work was impossible, and Martha had come out to the barn to check on a mare who had been off her feed, and Bernard was there doing the same, standing in the mare's stall and running a hand along her neck. "Her name is Clover," Martha said, coming into the stall and standing on the horse's other side. "She has been like this before when the weather changes hard." "She seems sound enough," Bernard said. "I think you are right that it is the weather. Her pulse is steady." "Elias brought her as a foal from a man in Santa Fe," Martha said. "She has always been sensitive, more sensitive than a ranch horse probably ought to be." She said this with an affection that was also slightly exasperated, the tone a person uses for something they love precisely because of the inconvenient quality they are describing. "What was he like?" Bernard asked. "Elias." He said it carefully, not in the way a person asks a question to fill silence, but in the way a person asks because they genuinely want to know. Martha was quiet for a moment, one hand flat on the mare's flank. "He was a good man," she said. "He was fair and he was honest and he worked hard every day of his life. He was not always an easy man to live beside. He was quiet in ways that sometimes felt like distance, and he carried things inside himself that he rarely let out, but he was good." She paused. "He was 20 years older than me. We married when I was 19. A lot of people thought it was an uneven arrangement, and in some ways they were right. But he treated me with more respect than any man I had ever known, and I was young, and that meant a great deal to me." Bernard did not say anything for a moment. Outside the barn, the rain came down in steady sheets against the roof, and Clover blew softly through her nose. "How old were you when you lost him?" he asked. 26, she said. "It was his heart. He was working the north pasture and he just stopped. Pete found him in the grass." Her voice was level, but he heard something underneath it, not fresh grief, but the settled scar of it. "I had 2 weeks of feeling like the world had ended, and then I got up and went to work. There was not another option. No family to go to. My mother is in Ohio. My father died when I was 12. I have a brother in Kansas City who sells insurance and who has written me 4 times in 2 years to tell me I should sell the ranch and come live near him and his wife, which tells you all you need to know about how well he understands the situation." She said it without anger, just the dry clarity of a person who has assessed their resources and found them precisely as limited as they are. Bernard smiled at that, a real smile, without calculation. "My father was the same way," he said. "Not about insurance, but about understanding what a person actually needs versus what they theoretically ought to need." She looked at him across the horse's back, and for the first time there was something in her expression that was not the careful distance of a woman assessing a hired hand. It was something more direct than that, the look of one person genuinely seeing another. "You said your father died in the spring," she said. "March," he said. "He had been sick through the winter, consumption. He held on longer than the doctor thought he would, which was typical of him." He felt the familiar weight of it, not sharp anymore, but dense. He was a hard man in some ways, not unkind but demanding. He believed in debts and he believed in honoring them. I used to think that was just stubbornness on his part. Now I think it was the way he held the world together. The idea that promises meant something, that one man's good act required another man's good act in return, and that the chain of it had to be maintained or everything fell apart. Martha looked at him steadily. "And that is why you are here." "That is part of why I am here," he said honestly, and he meant it to sound more neutral than it did, and he watched her register the slight gap between those two things, the part of the reason and the whole of it, with a small, careful expression that was not quite a smile. Neither of them said anything more about it that evening, but something had shifted, and they both knew it. The following week, Harlan Cole's solicitor came for what he announced was the final time with a final offer. He was a thin man named Whitmore in a very good coat, and he sat across the kitchen table from Martha with an air of practiced patience that was designed to feel like generosity, and actually felt like a threat-wearing courtesy as a costume. "Mrs. Rourke," Whitmore said, with a small adjustment of his cufflinks, "Mr. Cole is prepared to offer you $14,000 for the entirety of the Rourke land grant. This is a figure that exceeds the market value of the property by a significant margin, and it reflects Mr. Cole's sincere regard for your late husband's contribution to this county." Bernard was in the kitchen as well. He had been repairing the kitchen window frame when Whitmore arrived, and Martha had not asked him to leave, and he had not offered to. He stood to one side with his tools in his hand and said nothing, but he watched. "My answer is the same as it has always been," Martha said. "It is not for sale." Whitmore's expression of patient generosity did not change. "Mrs. Rourke, I want to be candid with you, as I think you are a woman who appreciates candor. The cattle market is changing. The big operations are becoming bigger, and the independent rancher is facing pressures that will only increase over the coming years. A woman in your position managing a property of this size without a husband. I have been managing this property without a husband for 2 years, Martha said, and her voice was perfectly level, and I expect to manage it for considerably longer. My answer is no, Mr. Whitmore. I will ask you to tell Mr. Cole that this answer will not change." Whitmore stood, and there was something in the way he gathered his coat that was less smooth than the way he had arrived. "Mr. Cole had hoped you would be reasonable," he said. "Mr. Cole can hope a great many things," Martha said. She stood and held the door open with a courtesy that was just barely indistinguishable from dismissal. Whitmore glanced at Bernard on his way out, a quick, assessing look that categorized him with professional efficiency, and then he was gone, and the sound of his horse and buggy faded down the cart track. Martha stood at the kitchen door for a moment after he left, and Bernard could see, from where he stood, the slight tension across her shoulders that she would not let show in her face. "He used the word reasonable," Bernard said. "He did," she said. "Men like Whitmore use that word when they have run out of other arguments and are about to start using other methods," he said. She turned to look at him. "Yes," she said, "that is my reading too. Do you have any documentation of your land rights, the original grant, the deed?" "In the strongbox in my bedroom," she said. "I have had them since Elias died, and I know exactly what they say. This valley was granted to Elias Rourke in 1869 by the Colorado Territorial Government, and it transferred to me as his heir on his death. The documents are in order. I had a lawyer in Pueblo look them over 18 months ago." "Good," Bernard said. "Keep them somewhere you can get to quickly." She looked at him with that level, assessing gaze. "You think he will try something?" "I think that visit was the last polite step before an impolite one," Bernard said. "I have seen this kind of thing before in Texas. Big operators like Cole, they have a progression. They try to buy, they try to pressure, and then they try something else." He met her eyes. "I do not want to alarm you unnecessarily, but I want you to know that I am not going anywhere until this situation is resolved." Martha looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression that was complicated, something that wanted to push back against the idea of needing anyone, because she had been standing on her own for 2 years and had made a certain pride out of it, and something else that was quieter and more honest that acknowledged the fact of his being here and what it meant. "All right," she said softly, and then, after a brief pause, "Thank you, Bernard." It was the first time she had used his given name. He turned back to the window frame and did not let her see his face. November came in cold and bright, with mornings that crackled with frost and afternoons that were clear and sharp as glass. The work on the ranch settled into a rhythm that Bernard had begun to find genuinely satisfying in a way that surprised him. He had been a man who moved, and now he was a man who stayed, and the staying was revealing something to him that the moving had kept hidden, which was how much he liked the particular texture of a place where he knew every fence post and creek bend, where he knew which horse would crowd the gate in the morning and which one hung back, where he knew the sound of the wind in the valley between the two ridges and how it was different from the wind anywhere else. He knew he was coming to love this valley. He was also aware that the valley was not his. He began to spend his evenings on the porch of the bunkhouse reading, partly because the evenings in this valley were extraordinary, with the stars coming out over the ridges in a thick wash of light that seemed to Bernard to be the most honest thing in the world, and partly because Martha often sat on the porch of the main house in the evenings to read herself, and he had found that the habit of being near her, even at a distance, even in the respectful silence of two people reading separately in the same evening air, was something he was deeply unwilling to give up. One evening in the second week of November, she crossed the yard and came to sit on the bunkhouse porch steps, which she had never done before, and she said, "Are you reading anything interesting?" He showed her the cover. It was a history of the cattle trails, a dry and technical volume that he had picked up in Pueblo. She smiled at it in the way a person smiles at something that is exactly as strange as they expected. "And is it interesting?" she asked. "Parts of it," he said. "The early chapters are good. The man who wrote it spent 2 years on the Kishom Trail, and he knows what he is talking about. Later on he starts inventing things." "How can you tell?" "Because I have been on the Kishom Trail, and some of what he says happened there did not happen, or at least not in the way he says." She looked at him with that clear, direct attention she gave to things she found genuinely interesting. "How many cattle drives did you ride?" "6, he said. "Started when I was 16. My father drove cattle and I drove cattle with him every summer from 16 to 22. After that I did other work, fencing, branding, a year as a deputy in a small town in Texas that I do not recommend as a career, and then back to cattle work because I knew how to do it." "A deputy," she said, and there was a new quality of interest in her voice. "Where in Texas?" "Laredo," he said. "I was 23 and I thought it was an adventure. It turned out to be more paperwork and less adventure than the word deputy suggested." She laughed, that short, genuine, slightly reluctant laugh, and he felt it like something physical, like warmth from a fire you had stepped close to without intending to. "Elias spent time in Texas," she said, "on the Brazos River. He always said it was the most beautiful country he had ever ridden through." "It is beautiful," Bernard agreed, "especially in spring. The whole country goes green and the rivers run high and clear." They talked for 2 hours without noticing the time, which was how Bernard knew that whatever was happening between them had moved past the manageable and into something else. He had not talked like this, really talked, without performance or purpose, just the genuine exchange of two people who found each other genuinely interesting, in more years than he wanted to count. When she finally stood to go inside, she stood for a moment on the porch step and looked at him in a way that was both direct and slightly uncertain, which was a combination he had not seen from her before. "I am glad you came, Bernard," she said. "Regardless of why you came, I am glad." He sat very still after she went inside and looked at the stars over the ridges and thought about his father and about promises, and about how some promises turn out to be more than what they appear on the surface, as though the person who asked you to make them knew something you did not yet know about where you needed to be. The trouble with Harlan Cole came on a Monday morning at the beginning of December, when 3 of Cole's men rode into the valley and informed Martha that there was a survey crew arriving the following week to assess the eastern boundary of the Rourke land, on the grounds that Cole's legal team had identified a potential discrepancy in the original land grant documentation. Bernard was in the barn when Martha came to find him, and he could tell from the way she was walking quick and straight, with the particular quality of controlled anger that comes from someone who has a great deal of it and is very practiced at containment. Exactly what kind of news she was carrying. She told him what the men had said, standing in the barn doorway with her arms folded. "A discrepancy," he repeated. "That is what they said. I asked them to explain the nature of the discrepancy, and they said that was a matter for the survey team and the legal team, and that they were only there to notify me of the scheduled survey." "They are manufacturing a land dispute," Bernard said. "It is a standard method. They find someone willing to draw up a document suggesting the original boundary was misrepresented. They file a claim with the Territorial Land Office, and then there is a legal proceeding that can take a year or more to resolve, during which time the property is under a cloud that makes it very difficult to operate or sell independently." Martha looked at him. "You know a lot about this." "I told you I saw it done in Texas," he said. "A man named Cray did the same thing to 4 ranches on the Nueces River. He manufactured competing claims, wore the ranchers down in legal proceedings, and then bought them out for a fraction of their value when they ran out of money to fight." "What happened to Cray?" she asked. "One of the ranchers he cheated had a very good lawyer from Austin who was willing to work on contingency," Bernard said. "Cray ended up losing 2 of his own properties in the counterclaim and leaving the county entirely." Martha uncrossed her arms. Something decisive had settled in her eyes. "I need to go to Pueblo," she said. "Today. I need to get ahead of this before that survey team arrives." "I will come with you," Bernard said. It was not a question. She looked at him, a look that no longer had any of the initial wariness in it, only something honest and steady and grateful, and something more than that which she was not yet naming, and said, "Yes." "All right." They rode to Pueblo together that afternoon, arriving in the early evening when the town was lit up with the warm yellow glow of lamplit windows, and the sounds of commerce and horses, and the everyday noise of a Colorado town in the winter of 1882. Pueblo was a proper town by then. It had a courthouse, a bank, 2 hotels, several saloons, a doctor's office, and a small but competent law practice run by a man named Joseph Aldridge who had studied in Philadelphia and come west for reasons he never fully explained to anyone, but who had been the most effective lawyer in the county for 15 years. Martha knew Aldridge. She had used him before, after Elias died, and he agreed to see them despite the hour. He was a compact, precise man in his 40s who listened to the description of Cole's maneuver with the particular attentiveness of a man who has seen many variations of the same scheme and finds it professionally irritating each time. "Cole has done this before," Aldridge said when Martha had finished. "The Barnes Ranch, 6 months ago. They folded after 4 months of proceedings. Could not afford to continue." "I can afford to continue," Martha said, with a firmness that was not bravado but simply true. "I know you can," Aldridge said. "What I want to do is file a preemptive declaration with the land office tomorrow morning, asserting the validity of the original grant and requesting that any survey be conducted with your legal representative present. This puts the burden on Cole to produce his alleged discrepancy rather than letting him control the process." He looked at Bernard. "Mr. Garrett, are you planning to remain in the valley?" "I am," Bernard said. Aldridge nodded. "Good. A property that is being actively and visibly worked and defended is considerably harder to claim against than one that appears abandoned or mismanaged. I want to be frank with you, both Cole is powerful and he has resources, but he is also not the first powerful man to discover that legal maneuvers require actual legal substance, and a grant that was properly issued in 1869 by the territorial government is a very solid piece of documentation." They stayed overnight in Pueblo, Martha at the hotel, Bernard at the bunkhouse behind the livery stable, because he was a careful man, and he was aware of how small towns talked, and he did not want anyone finding a reason to say something ungracious about Martha Rourke's reputation. In the morning they attended Aldridge's office again, as the declaration was drawn up and signed, and by 10 o'clock it had been filed with the Territorial Land Office, and they rode back to the valley in the sharp December sunlight with something that felt like the beginning of a counterattack and not entirely unlike hope. On the way home, somewhere between Pueblo and the ridge above the valley, Martha said, "I have been thinking about something." Bernard looked at her. She was riding Clover, who was fine today in the cold, clear air, and her hair was half escaped from its pins, and the wind was putting color in her face, and she was looking straight ahead at the ridge in the way she looked at things she was still thinking through. "What have you been thinking about?" he said. "I have been thinking about what you said when you first got here," she said, "that if I did not need anything you would ride on and consider the debt paid." He did not say anything. "I have been thinking that I was very glad I gave you a reason to stay," she said. "The fence line and the barn wall and all of the rest of it, I was glad they existed. Not because I could not have managed without the help, but because they meant you did not leave." Bernard kept his eyes on the trail ahead. He was aware of his heartbeat in a way that was almost embarrassing for a man of 31 who had done the work he had done and been in the places he had been. "I would have found a reason to stay anyway," he said, "if you had wanted me to." She turned to look at him then, and the wind pushed a strand of auburn hair across her face, and she did not push it away, just looked at him with those green eyes that were capable of so much patience and warmth and directness, and something else that he recognized now, because he felt it himself, which was the very specific tenderness of a person who has been lonely for a long time, recognizing that they are not lonely in this particular moment, and that this particular moment might be something they do not want to let go of. "I would have wanted you to," she said. They did not say anything more for the rest of the ride, but the silence between them had changed entirely from what it had been the first week, when it was the silence of two careful strangers. Now it was the silence of two people who had said something real and were letting it settle into the air between them, where it could be felt on every side. Cole's survey team arrived, as promised, 1 week later. There were 4 of them, with a wagon full of survey equipment and an air of professional indifference to the fact that they were working land that was not their employer's. Joseph Aldridge arrived at the same time. He had timed it deliberately, and he stood at the property boundary with the filed declaration in his hand and informed the survey team leader that any survey conducted on this property was being conducted with legal oversight, and that any findings would be subject to immediate review by the Territorial Land Office. The survey team did their work. They were there for 2 days, and Bernard and Cobb and Pete watched them the whole time from a respectful distance that was also a very clear distance. And Martha came out both mornings and walked the boundary herself, watching everything with that level, attentive gaze that seemed to unsettle the survey team members in a way that was quietly satisfying. Aldridge looked at the survey findings and, 3 weeks later, sent a letter informing Martha that the survey had found no discrepancy of any kind with the original land grant boundaries, and that he had communicated this to Cole's legal team in writing, and that he was cautiously optimistic that the manufactured land dispute had failed before it began. Martha read the letter at the kitchen table on a December morning with snow falling outside the window, and she looked up from it and across the table at Bernard, who had become a fixture at the kitchen table for morning coffee in the way that happens gradually and then all at once. First there because of some practical discussion, then there because it was natural, then there because neither of them could fully imagine mornings without it, and she said, "It looks like the land is still mine." "The land was always yours," he said. She folded the letter carefully and set it on the table and looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at him. "Bernard," she said. "Martha," he said. They looked at each other across the table, and there was something in the air between them that was the size and shape of everything that had not been said yet. And then Martha laughed that short, real, wonderful laugh and said, "This is ridiculous. We are sitting here like two people who have never met." "We met in October," he said, "on a morning when I said something stupid in your doorway." "You said I was not the widow," she said. Which was accurate, he said. Which was accurate, she agreed, smiling now, really smiling. Not the contained, careful expression she had worn through the early weeks, but something open and warm that changed her whole face, that made him feel he was seeing something he was very glad to be allowed to see. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, which was resting on the letter, and she looked down at their hands and then back up at him, and he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am asking it plainly, not out of politeness and not out of any obligation to my father's memory or anyone else's." "All right," she said very quietly. "I would like to court you, Mrs. Rourke," he said, "properly, if that is something you would want." The snow fell outside the window. The fire crackled in the hearth. Clover could be heard moving in her stall in the barn, that familiar soft shuffling sound that had become as natural to Bernard as the sound of his own breathing. "It is something I would want," Martha said, "very much." He turned her hand over so that her palm was up and held it between both of his, and she looked at him with those green eyes full of everything she had not yet put into words but which he could read as clearly as print on a page. And he thought that this exact moment, this kitchen, this valley, this woman was the truest thing that had ever happened to him. They spent Christmas quietly, the four of them, Bernard and Martha and Cobb and Pete, with a meal that Martha cooked with the focused enjoyment of someone who genuinely loved the domestic arts, but had rarely had enough people to cook for. She made a proper roasted chicken with potatoes and a dried apple pie that Cobb declared was the finest pie he had ever eaten, which made Martha laugh and wave a hand at him in the way a person does when they are genuinely pleased by a compliment but feel they should appear modest about it. After the meal they sat by the fire in the main house parlor and Pete played his guitar. He had a real talent for it, a light-fingered, easy style that made even the difficult songs sound effortless. And Bernard watched Martha in the firelight with the kind of helpless attention he had stopped trying to disguise, and she looked back at him with the same quality of attention. And Cobb, who was a perceptive man, looked at both of them with the satisfied expression of a person watching something they have been waiting to happen for some time. "You going to stay on permanent, then?" Cobb asked Bernard, with the deliberate casualness of a man who knows the answer but wants to hear it said. "I expect so," Bernard said, and Martha from across the room did not look away. January was hard, as January in Colorado generally was, with deep cold and snow that came in off the mountains and piled against every windward surface and made the morning work a battle against the elements every single day. Bernard loved it. He had not expected to love the cold work, but he did. There was something about the way the valley looked under snow, white and still between the dark limestone ridges, with the creek running black through the middle of it, that felt to him like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in a life that had covered a great deal of country. He and Martha began to take a walk together in the evenings after supper, once the cold had moved past the bitter stage into something merely crisp. They would follow the creek down to where it bent west under the willow trees, and then back up through the pasture gate, and they would talk the whole way about the ranch, about their childhoods, about books they had read and places they had been, and things they believed and things they were uncertain about. Bernard found in those walks that Martha Rourke was one of the most genuinely intelligent people he had ever spent time with, not in the bookish way, though she read widely and remembered everything, but in the way of a person who had thought hard about the actual texture of life and arrived at conclusions that were honest and carefully held. She told him, on one of those evening walks in the January cold, about the year she had been young and restless in Ohio, and had read everything she could find about the Western territories, and had become convinced that the West was the one place in the world where a person could make a life that was genuinely their own, without the weight of every expectation and convention that Ohio had piled on her since birth. "And then you married a man 20 years older than you and came to Colorado," Bernard said, not unkindly. And then I came to Colorado, she agreed, which was exactly what I wanted. Elias was part of that. He was a way to get here, but he was more than that too. He was a genuinely good man, and I was genuinely fond of him, and I am not going to diminish that, even knowing that I was also 19 and running towards something and he was there. She paused. But this is mine now, not his. Not his son's. He had a son from a first marriage who is in California and wants nothing to do with the ranch. Mine. And that is different from anything I had before. Bernard kicked a small stone off the path into the snow. Do you ever worry that you love the land more than any person in it? He asked. She looked at him. I used to, she said. I used to think that was probably true and that it might always be true, and I was not entirely troubled by it. She paused again, and then she said, with the particular directness that he had come to love about her, I am less certain of that now. He stopped walking. She took one more step and then stopped too, and turned to look at him in the pale winter moonlight that came off the snow and made the whole valley glow with a faint silver-blue light. Martha, he said. Bernard, she said, and she was smiling just slightly, the way she smiled when she knew exactly what was happening and was letting it happen anyway. He kissed her for the first time standing in the snow beside the creek, with the willows around them and the stars above them, and the lights of the ranch house visible across the pasture, warm and yellow in the darkness. She kissed him back with a frankness and warmth that was completely consistent with who she was. There was nothing hesitant or performed about it. It was just Martha, real and present and warm and entirely herself. And when they separated, she looked at him with those extraordinary eyes and said, very quietly, I have been wanting to do that for some time. Since when? He asked. She thought about it with a small, deliberate pause that suggested she knew the answer perfectly well, but was considering how much to admit. Since the evening you sat in the barn with Clover in the rain and told me about your father, she said. A man who tends to a horse and talks about what he believes in with that kind of honesty, that is a man worth paying attention to. He laughed and she laughed, and he put his arm around her and they walked back to the ranch house through the snow, their boots crunching in the frozen crust of it, and everything, the valley, the work, the difficulty of what had come before and what might still come, felt absolutely right. In February, Harlan Cole made one more move. It was not a legal move this time. It was more direct and more unsettling. One of the Rourke cattle, a good steer, one of the better animals in the herd, turned up dead on the east side of the property, near the boundary. There was nothing natural about it. Bernard examined the animal carefully and found a single clean wound that told him everything he needed to know. He told Martha that evening, and he watched her face go through something he had not seen from her before, a flicker of genuine fear, quickly controlled, quickly replaced by anger, and then by something harder and more practical than either. He is escalating, she said. Yes, Bernard said. This is a message. He wants you to know he can reach onto your property and take something from you. What do we do? First, I want to write to a man I know in Denver, Bernard said. A Pinkerton man, not for detectives, for testimony. I want to establish a documented record of events so that if anything further happens, there is a clear record of the pattern and who is responsible for it. And second, I think it is time to have a conversation with Harlan Cole himself, Bernard said. Not through lawyers and not through messages. In person. Martha looked at him. You want to go see him? I want to go see him, Bernard said. I want to make it very clear that whatever impression he has of this situation, that you are alone, that you are without resources, that you can be worn down and frightened into selling, is not accurate. I want him to look at the actual situation and make a new assessment. Martha studied him for a long moment. Bernard, she said, I need you to promise me that this conversation will only be a conversation. It will only be a conversation, he said. I have no intention of doing anything that puts you or this ranch in a worse position. I am 31 years old, not 20, and I learned a long time ago that the fastest way to solve a problem is very rarely the most effective way. She believed him. He could see that she believed him, and it meant something to him that she had learned enough of him in 4 months to trust his judgment in a situation like this. He wrote to Cole's Maine ranch the following week. It was a large, prosperous-looking operation about 12 miles east of Rourke Valley, with a proper ranch house that was more like a house a wealthy man would build in a city, with real glass windows and a painted front porch, and a yard that was kept by someone who had time to keep it. Cole himself came to the door, a big, florid man in his 50s, with the manner of someone who had been wealthy long enough to mistake courtesy for a personal favor he was extending. The conversation was brief and extremely clear. Bernard told Cole that the Rourke Ranch was not for sale and would not become for sale. He told Cole that a documented record of events beginning with the Cole solicitor's visits and ending with the dead steer was being compiled by a Pinkerton employee in Denver. He told Cole that if any further incidents occurred on or near Rourke land, this record would be delivered to the territorial governor's office and to the Federal Land Commission, both of which had been paying increasing attention to land consolidation practices in the Colorado Territory. Cole listened to all of this with the careful attention of a man calculating odds. "You are a long way from your own business, Garrett," Cole said. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be," Bernard said. There was a silence between them that had the quality of two men looking at each other across a table, and each making a clear-eyed assessment of what the other one was willing to do. Cole looked away first. Not because he was afraid, he was not a man who scared easily, but because he was a practical man, and the Pinkerton documentation and the territorial land office filing and the undeniable fact of a good lawyer and a well-documented property was a different calculation than a widow alone in a valley with 2 hired hands. "Mrs. Rourke is fortunate in her friends," Cole said at last, with the smile of a man who has decided to find a different piece of land. "She is," Bernard agreed. He rode back to the valley with the cold wind on his face and a quiet certainty in his chest that the danger had passed. Not because Cole had suddenly become a better man, but because Cole was a practical man, and practical men moved on to easier targets when the current target proved genuinely difficult. When he got back and told Martha what had happened, she sat very still for a moment, and then she got up from the kitchen table and walked to where he was standing by the door, and she put her arms around him and held on with a directness and warmth that undid something in him entirely, some last careful distance he had maintained, some last protective wall between what he wanted and what he allowed himself to want. He held her back and pressed his face into her hair and thought, "This is it. This is the thing, this valley and this woman and this life." Spring came to the valley in the way spring comes to Colorado, sudden and extravagant, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, the grass coming up green and thick overnight, the cottonwoods along the ridge throwing out their soft catkins and filling the air with drifting white. The horses were restless with it, and the cattle were fat and healthy after a winter in which they had been well tended, and the east barn wall that Bernard had rebuilt in October stood solid and squared in the bright April light. On a morning in late April, Bernard found Martha at the kitchen garden, turning the soil with a fork for planting, and he watched her from the yard gate for a moment. This woman who had come west looking for a life that was genuinely her own, who had made a life here by the sheer sustained force of her intelligence and her will, who laughed that short, wonderful laugh and read by the fire, and walked the creek in the evenings, and had somehow, in the course of the last several months, become the center of gravity of his entire existence. He opened the gate and walked across the yard, and she looked up from the garden and smiled at him with that open, warm smile that still hit him square in the chest every single time. "I need to ask you something," he said. She pushed the fork into the earth and leaned on the handle and looked at him with clear, attentive eyes. "I have been thinking about the ranch," he said, "about what it needs and what you need and what I want." He was not a man who fumbled words, but he was aware that he was close to it now, and he squared himself the way he did in the saddle when he wanted to arrive with some dignity. "I want to stay here, not as a hand, not as someone who came to pay a debt. I want to stay because this is where I want to be, and because you are who I want to be beside, and because this valley is the most beautiful piece of country I have ever seen in my life, and I cannot imagine leaving it." He paused. "I am asking if you will marry me, Martha." Martha Rourke looked at him for a moment that seemed to stretch out into the bright spring morning, and the creek ran behind them, and the horses moved in the pasture, and a meadowlark called from somewhere on the south ridge, and she said, very clearly and without any hesitation whatsoever, "Yes." He crossed the garden in 2 steps, getting soil on his boots, and she laughed as he reached her, and he kissed her in the middle of the kitchen garden with the April sun on both of them and her hand still holding the garden fork, and it was perfect and undignified and entirely right. Cobb, watching from the barn door, turned to Pete and said, "I believe we owe each other $1." Pete grinned. "I said November, you said Christmas. Seems we were both wrong." "Spring is better anyway," Cobb said, and went back to work with the expression of a man who is quietly very satisfied with how things have turned out. They married in June, on a Saturday morning, in the small church in Pueblo that Martha had attended on the 3 or 4 occasions a year when the ride to town made practical sense. Joseph Aldridge stood up for Bernard, because he had become genuinely fond of them both through the course of the winter's legal work. Cobb walked Martha down the aisle because she had asked him to, and because he was the closest thing she had to family on this side of the country, and he did it with the solemnity and pride of a man who understands the honor of being asked. The ceremony was brief. The minister, a practical man named Reverend Oakes, had known enough frontier couples to understand that efficiency was not the enemy of reverence, and when he pronounced them man and wife and Bernard turned to look at Martha, she was smiling up at him with those green eyes luminous in the church light, and he thought, "I rode into this valley carrying a dead man's promise and the wrong picture in my head, and I found the truest thing I have ever found." He kissed his wife in front of Reverend Oakes and Aldridge and Cobb and Pete, and a smattering of Pueblo townspeople who had come out of curiosity and stayed for sentiment, and it was a very good kiss, and Cobb applauded with more vigor than was strictly required. The summer after the wedding was the fullest Bernard had ever known. There was so much to do and so much to be glad about that the days ran over with both, and still there was more. He and Martha worked the ranch together in a way that felt like the natural expression of everything they were. She was the strategist and the keeper of accounts, and the person who understood the land's patterns in the deep, bone-level way of someone who had walked it in every season. He was the one who built and repaired and could ride all day without fatigue, and who knew cattle the way a person knows a language they were born into. Together, they were considerably more than either of them was alone. In the evenings they sat on the main house porch, which had become their porch, and watched the valley in the last light, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they sat in the easy silence of 2 people who are completely comfortable in each other's presence, and sometimes Martha would lean her head against his shoulder and he would put his arm around her, and they would just be there, which was the most uncomplicated happiness Bernard had ever experienced. The first winter of their marriage, Cobb broke his wrist badly in a fall from a horse in December, and was off work for 6 weeks, which would have been a serious setback if Bernard had not been there to absorb the extra work, and which led to the arrangement that Cobb would shift gradually into a foreman-type role as the years passed, doing the administrative and organizational work that his experience made him very good at, while Pete, and a new young hand named Josu Vargas, a capable young man from a Mexican family that had been in Colorado for 3 generations, took on more of the physical labor. Josu came to them in the early spring, referred by a rancher friend of Pete's, and he was 22 and hardworking and extremely good with horses, and he fit into the life of the ranch with the ease of someone who was exactly in the right place. Bernard liked him immediately. So did Martha. There was a directness about the young man that reminded Bernard, in certain lights, of himself at that age, before the years on the trail had taught him the value of patience. In August of 1883, Just under a year after Bernard had first ridden down into the valley, Martha told him on a warm evening on the porch that she thought they were going to need to think about preparing the small back bedroom of the main house for a new use. Bernard turned to look at her, and she was watching him with those clear green eyes and a small, careful smile, and he understood. He reached over and took her hand and held it and was quiet for a moment because the fullness of it was extraordinary and required a moment to absorb. This valley, this woman, and now this. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said because he loved her and it was the most important question. "I am very well," she said warmly. "Better than well." "Good," he said, and then he said nothing more for a long moment and simply held her hand and looked at the valley in the summer evening, and felt something that a man who has spent his life moving and not putting down roots does not often get to feel. The total, grounded certainty that he is exactly where he is supposed to be. Their son was born in April of 1884, on a morning when the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the meadowlarks were calling from every fence post on the south ridge, as though the whole valley was marking the occasion. They named him Thomas Elias Garrett Thomas for Bernard's father and Elias for Martha's first husband, because she had loved him in her way and he deserved to be remembered. And Bernard thought it was right that the name of the man who had started the whole chain of obligation and promise and consequence that had brought him here should live on in the next generation. Thomas was a sturdy, loud, opinionated baby who had Bernard's gray eyes and Martha's auburn hair, and who demonstrated from his first weeks of life that he had inherited his mother's complete refusal to do anything in an uncomplicated way. Cobb was besotted with him instantly and shamelessly, and Pete made him a carved wooden horse before he was 2 months old, and Jasu, who was the oldest of 7 children and therefore completely unintimidated by infants, was the only one of them besides Martha who could reliably get the baby to stop crying when the crying went on past a reasonable hour. Martha took to motherhood with the same combination of capability and genuine love that she brought to everything else, and she nursed Thomas through his first difficult months with the patient attention of someone who is very good at learning what something needs and very committed to providing it. Bernard watched her with their son and felt something he could not have predicted, a tenderness so acute it was almost painful, the tenderness of a man who had not thought he wanted this thing and found, now that he had it, that it was the best thing he had ever had. They grew the herd that year, buying 20 additional cattle from a rancher in the San Luis Valley who was downsizing, and they began to think seriously about the south pasture, which had been underused, and whether to plant some of it with alfalfa to reduce the winter feed costs. Bernard rode the fence lines in the late summer evenings when Thomas was sleeping, with Clover's pasture mate, a young gray gelding he had bought in the spring and named Creek. He was a man who named horses after the things he loved most about the valley, and he thought about the ranch's future with the long view of a man who was planning to be here for a very long time. In the fall of 1884, they received a letter from Joseph Aldridge informing them that Harlan Cole had, in fact, sold his Colorado operations to an Eastern cattle company and retired to California, and that the various land pressure tactics Cole had employed across the county had been formally investigated by the Territorial Land Commissioner and found to be fraudulent, and that several of the ranchers Cole had driven out had been awarded compensation from the proceedings. The letter was satisfying in the way a well-closed account is satisfying, not triumphant, just complete. Martha read the letter at the kitchen table and folded it and set it on the pile of correspondence and looked across the table at Bernard with a small, quiet smile. "California," she said. "I am sure California is very glad to have him," Bernard said. She laughed, and Thomas, who was 6 months old and in her arms and had recently discovered that his mother's laugh was extremely interesting, looked up at her with wide gray-green eyes and waved one fist with the enthusiasm of someone who intends to participate in whatever is happening. The years that followed were good years. They were not without difficulty. No years on a working ranch in the Colorado Territory were without difficulty. There were drought years and flood years and years when the cattle market went soft and years when the weather was merciless. In the winter of 1886, they lost 8 cattle to a storm that came in off the mountains with no warning, and Bernard and Josu spent 3 days in brutal cold searching the north pasture, and finding some that survived and some that had not. And he came home on the 3rd evening frozen through and exhausted, and Martha put him by the fire and brought him hot broth and sat beside him with her hand on his back, not saying anything, just being there, and it was enough. In 1887, Martha had their second child, a daughter this time, born in October on a golden afternoon, and they named her Rose Margaret Garrett, for the wild roses that grew along the creek in summer, and for Bernard's mother who had died when he was young and whom he had thought about more, since having children of his own, than he had in all the years before. Rose was quieter than Thomas had been, a watchful, curious child who sat in the kitchen and observed everything with those wide eyes, and then surprised you by saying something precise and accurate about what she had been watching. Martha said she was going to either be a judge or a doctor, and Bernard said probably both, and they were only half joking. Thomas, by the time Rose arrived, was 3½ and deeply interested in horses and deeply uninterested in any arrangement that was not of his own devising. He had Bernard's steadiness and Martha's stubbornness, and the combination was a force of nature in miniature. He followed Josu around the barn from the time he could walk, and Josu, who was patient and gentle and thought of the Garrett children as something close to younger siblings, taught him to brush a horse before he could reliably do up his own boots. The ranch grew and deepened in those years, the way something does when it is genuinely cared for, not just expanded but enriched, each year adding something to the texture of it that the previous year had built toward. Bernard added a proper root cellar in 1888 and a covered wellhead that made the winter water work considerably less brutal. Martha planted fruit trees along the south-facing slope below the kitchen garden, apples and pears, slow-growing, with the full patience of someone who plants for the future rather than the immediate. And when Thomas was 7, he helped her mulch the young trees in the fall, taking the work extremely seriously, and Rose sat in the wheelbarrow and supervised. Cobb's wrist healed but never fully returned to its original strength, and he took on more and more of the administrative and organizational work with a satisfaction that surprised even him. It turned out that a man who had spent his life doing physical work and who was naturally intelligent had a great deal of aptitude for the organizational side of ranching, and under his management, the record-keeping and scheduling of the operation became considerably more efficient. He stayed on at the Garrett Ranch for the rest of his working life, and Bernard and Martha considered him family, and he considered himself so too, and the 4 of them 5 with Pete, who stayed on for many years and then eventually left to start his own small ranch in the San Luis Valley with a woman he married in 1887, were a community. The kind of community that people build for themselves when geography and circumstance and genuine affection combine to create something more durable than any of its parts. Josu Vargas stayed too, and in the spring of 1889 he brought a young woman named Clara to meet Martha and Bernard, and he stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and introduced her with the mixture of pride and vulnerability that young men show when they are bringing the person they love to meet the people whose opinion they most care about. Clara was 20 and clear-eyed and practical and warm, and Martha liked her immediately, and Bernard looked at Josu, this young man who had come to them at 22 and worked beside them through the good years and the difficult ones, and felt something like a father's pride, which surprised him. Josu and Clara were married the following summer in the same Pueblo church where Bernard and Martha had married, and they built a small house on the south end of the Garrett land on a patch of ground Bernard had offered them, and the sound of more life in the valley. A second household, more voices, more horses in the pasture, suited the place in a way that felt like natural growth. In the fall of 1889, when Thomas was 5 and Rose was 2, and the Colorado Territory was on the edge of statehood. Colorado had become a state in 1876, and by 1889, the structures of civic life were settling deeper into the old landscape. Bernard and Martha sat on the porch one October evening in the kind of autumn light that makes the whole world look like it has been illuminated from within, amber and golden and precise. Thomas was in the yard chasing the spotted dog, the same dog that had been sleeping on the steps when Bernard first arrived. Older now, but still game, and Rose was on the porch between them, absorbed in the serious project of lining up small stones in an arrangement that had apparent logic only to herself. Martha had her head on Bernard's shoulder, which she often did in the evenings now, and he had his arm around her, and they were watching Thomas and the dog, and the way the last light moved across the valley grass. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you had arrived and I had been the old widow you were expecting?" Martha asked in the tone of a person who has thought about this before and is curious about his answer. Bernard smiled. "I think I would have fixed the fence line and the barn wall and ridden on," he said, "and I would have spent the rest of my life not knowing what I had missed." "And what would you have done instead?" she asked. "Kept moving," he said. "That is what I did before. I kept moving because there was nothing to stay for." "And now," she said. He looked at the valley, at the horses in the pasture, and the creek catching the last light, and the ridges on either side dark against the deepening sky, and the lights coming on in Josu and Clara's house at the south end of the property, warm and yellow in the dusk. And then he looked at his wife, at Martha, who had opened a door in the expectation of a stranger, and given him 4 months' worth of fence mending and honest conversation and evening walks along the creek, and everything that came after. "Now there is everything to stay for," he said. She looked up at him, and her eyes in the evening light were as green and clear as the first morning, and she smiled with that full, open smile that had been making him forget his own name for 7 years, and she said, "I am glad you rode into this valley, Bernard Garrett." "So am I," he said, "Mrs. Garrett." She laughed, that wonderful, real, short laugh, and Rose looked up from her stones, and said something with great authority in the 2-year-old's vocabulary that neither of them could fully decipher, but which sounded like agreement. And Thomas came running up the porch steps with the dog and collapsed in a heap at their feet, breathing hard, and the dog put its gray muzzle on Thomas's stomach and huffed contentedly. Bernard sat on his own porch in his own valley in the October evening with his wife against his side and his children at his feet and the horses moving in the pasture in the last light, and the feeling in his chest was so large and full and complete that it had no name, or rather it had one name, and that name was home. The creek ran on past the willows, the way it had always run and would go on running long after all of them. The stars came out over the ridge, thick and clear. The spotted dog snored softly in the lamplight spilling from the door, and Martha's hand was warm in his, and the valley held them all in its long, green, steady arms. He had ridden in expecting a debt to pay. He had found, instead, the thing he had not known he was looking for, and he had had the good sense, or the good fortune, or perhaps simply the grace that sometimes falls on a man who keeps his promises, to recognize it when he opened the door.